to this. There's a obvious worldwide audience, but there are people in overflow rooms, and you're here for the right reasons. Let me recognize a few of our very special guests in the front rows. Dr. Susan DeMarco Johnson, who is the wife of the Secretary. Where is she? There she is, right in front of me. Some of the DHS leadership, including Deputy Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, the General Counsel, Stephen Brunel, Julia Pearson. Is Julia Pearson here? Yes, she is. The first director of the U.S. Secret Service, ... who happens to be a woman. FEMA director, you should applaud for that. FEMA Director Craig Fugate, Acting Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Thomas Winkowski, and by the way, the nominee for CBP, Gil Kierlikowski, spoke here recently on drugs strategy. A number of ambassadors and members of two groups, the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group, they're all sitting in the front rows, and the Homeland Security Advisory Council. These are folks who in various ways, including me, I'm a co-chair of the Aspen group, and I'm on the other group, are trying to give our best advice to a very qualified new Secretary of Homeland Security. Leading DHS is a tough job. Some of us were the founding mothers and fathers. I certainly was a member of Congress when it was created, and blending the culture of 22 agencies, reporting to more than 100 different congressional committees and subcommittees. DOD only reports to 36, Mr. Secretary, and keeping Americans safe as the terror threat continues to evolve is daunting. Security is my bag, as I said, and as a former 9-term member of Congress who chaired the Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terror Risk Assessment Subcommittee, it's a mouthful, of the House Homeland Security Committee, and who represented some of our most vulnerable infrastructure, including LAX and the Port of Los Angeles, I can tell you that a decade after its establishment, the department remains a work in progress. But significant progress has been made, and lots of it has been showcased here at the Wilson Center. In the past year, we welcomed former Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano to discuss the efforts to include the private sector in DHS's cybersecurity efforts, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius on government capacity against terror threats in a borderless world, and just this week, our Canada Institute hosted an event on the entry-exit systems in North America. As I mentioned, over the past 3 years, we have hosted the winter meeting of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group, which is co-chaired by former Secretary Michael Chertoff and me. And just this morning, we met for an hour and a half with the Secretary talking about a report we have produced to recommend some action he might take, and we hope to be useful in the future. So, today, I'm pleased to welcome Secretary Jeh Johnson for his first major policy address since taking office on December 23rd. As a former assistant U.S. attorney, lawyer in private practice, general counsel of the Air Force, and later DOD, Jeh Johnson has been on the front lines of counterterrorism policy, from desperately needed reforms at Guantanamo Bay to our U.S. drone policy. He might, more said later. In a major speech at the Oxford Union in 2012, he said, quote, "We must be able to say to ourselves that our efforts should no longer be considered an armed conflict against al-Qaeda and its associated forces, rather a counterterrorism effort against individuals who are scattered remnants of al-Qaeda, who are parts of groups unaffiliated with al-Qaeda, for which the law enforcement and intelligence resources of our government are principally responsible in cooperation with the international community." He didn't know it then, but it was his tryout speech for DHS Secretary. He is thoughtful and courageous, and he will need these skills as he confronts the threats of today and those of the future. He will outline those threats in his speech, so I'm skipping the stuff that I had put here, but I just want to say that 2014 will be a pivotal year. It surely is, as we speak, in Sochi, in Syria, and in other places around the world, and the Secretary is here to help us understand what is on his agenda. Please welcome Secretary Jeh Johnson.
Thank you, Jane. Before I begin with my remarks, I did want to acknowledge two other people in the audience here today. First is FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, who I think everyone agrees has done a wonderful job in the leadership of that government agency. I'd also like to acknowledge the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Bob Papp, who is a strong, solid leader of the United States Coast Guard. I know that a number of people in the Coast Guard are very proud of his leadership. Admiral Papp is retiring in May after a distinguished career in public service in the defense of our nation at the Coast Guard. I begin by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Aspen Homeland Security Group for inviting me to speak here today. I also want to thank Jane Harmon for your leadership, your continued service to our country, and your willingness to be a supporter, mentor, and advisor to me and to numerous others around this town. When Jane Harmon advises, I listen. As many of you have heard me say before, September 11th is my birthday. On September 11th, 2001, I was in the private practice of law in New York City. Like millions of others, I was an eyewitness to the events of that day. I watched in shock as a beautiful, serene, and ordinary workday was transformed in an instant to one of the worst days in American history, while thousands of people, and ultimately a nation, coped with a tragedy that theretofore was unimaginable. It was out of that day that the Department of Homeland Security was born, and it was out of that day my own personal commitment to the mission of Homeland Security was born. For the next several minutes, I would like to take the opportunity Jane has provided me to spell out my vision for the department I am privileged to lead. A cliche too often used is that we are in a time of transition, quote unquote. The Department of Homeland Security must always be in a time of transition. We must be agile and vigilant in continually adapting to evolving threats and hazards. We must stay one step ahead of the next terror attack, the next cyber attack, and the next natural disaster. The most important part of my day as secretary is the morning intel brief, which ranges in scope from the latest terrorist plotting to a weather map. We monitor world events real time and take action when necessary to confront and respond to these threats. In support of Russian authorities, we are keeping a close eye on the Sochi Olympics, which are beginning pretty much as I speak. Within the last 48 hours, we have, out of an abundance of caution, issued advisories to air carriers and others based on what we've learned, adjusted TSA security measures, and are continually evaluating whether more is necessary. Also within the last 48 hours, in response to a very different type of hazard, FEMA has delivered 95 generators to the state of Pennsylvania, where several 100,000 people are without power due to the snow and cold weather. In the Homeland Security world, no news is good news, and no news is often the result of the hard work, vigilance, and dedication of people within our government who prevent bad things you never hear about, or at least help the public protect itself and recover from the storms we cannot prevent. Our overall challenge within the Department of Homeland Security and within the Homeland Security community of the federal, state, and local governments of this nation is to learn from and adapt to the changing character of the evolving threats and the hazards we face. 9/11, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the underwear bomber in 2009, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013 illustrate these evolving threats and hazards. The terrorist threat we face is increasingly decentralized, self-motivated, and maybe harder to detect. The cyber threat we face is growing and poses a greater concern to a critical infrastructure that is becoming increasingly interdependent. Natural disasters are becoming more severe, causing significant economic losses, and with more variable consequences driven by climate change and aging infrastructure. The basic missions of the Department of Homeland Security are and should be, and should continue to be, preventing terrorism and enhancing security, securing and managing our borders, enforcing and administering our immigration laws, safeguarding cyberspace, safeguarding critical infrastructure, and preparing for and responding to natural disasters. As we all know, at the time DHS was created in 2003, it was the most substantial reorganization of our government since 1947. In my opinion, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 was long overdue. Many other nations who faced threats similar to ours had ministries of the interior or a home office with the same basic missions of bridging national and domestic security, counterterrorism, and border and port security. Perhaps because our nation was protected by two big oceans from many of the world's hotspots, we thought that one department of the United States government devoted to the mission of Homeland Security was unnecessary. That thinking obviously changed on 9/11. Further, consider where all the 22 components of Homeland Security existed before the creation of the department in 2003. Scattered across the departments of Agriculture, Energy, Justice, Treasury, Transportation, Defense, Health and Human Services, and the General Services Administration, including departments that do not have national security or law enforcement as their core mission. In just 7 weeks in office as secretary, I have already seen the wisdom of combining a number of these capabilities within one department of government. When I convene a meeting to discuss how the latest terrorist threats might penetrate the homeland, the participants include DHS's Intelligence and Analysis Office, Customs and Border Protection, TSA, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Citizenship and Immigration Services, the Coast Guard, and DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate. Put another way, with the creation of DHS, a terrorist searching for weaknesses along our air, land, and sea borders or ports of entry is now met with one federal response from me. Preventing terrorist attacks on the homeland is and should remain the cornerstone of Homeland Security. Through our government's counterterrorism efforts in both the Bush and Obama administrations, we have put al-Qaeda's core leadership on the path to defeat, but the threat has evolved. Since about 2009, we saw the rise of al-Qaeda affiliates, such as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has made repeated efforts to export terrorism to our homeland. Our government, working with others, must continually deny these affiliates a safe haven, a place to hide, train, and from which to launch terrorist attacks. We are very focused on foreign fighters heading to Syria right now. Based on our work and the work of our international partners, we know individuals from the US, Canada, and Europe are traveling to Syria to fight in the conflict. At the same time, extremists are actively trying to recruit Westerners, indoctrinate them, and see them return to their home countries with an extremist mission. Last night, I returned from Poland, where the Attorney General and I met with my 6 counterparts from the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland. Syria was the #1 topic of conversation for them and for us. Syria has become a matter of homeland security. DHS, the FBI, and the intelligence community will continue to work closely to identify those foreign fighters that represent a threat to the homeland. We face threats from those who self-radicalize to violence, the so-called lone wolf, who did not train at an al-Qaeda camp or overseas or became part of an enemy force. but who may be inspired by radical violent ideology to do harm to Americans. In many respects, this is the terrorist threat to the homeland, illustrated last year by the Boston Marathon bombing, that I worry about the most. It may be the hardest to detect. Involves independent actors living within our midst with easy access to things that, in the wrong hands, become tools of mass violence. We must remain vigilant in detecting and countering all these threats. At the Department of Defense, I was witness to the extraordinary efforts of our military and the other national security and intelligence components of our government in countering terrorist threats from overseas. Here at home, given the evolving and increasingly diffuse and decentralized threat, I believe it is critical over the next several years that DHS continue to build relationships with state and local governments and the first responders in those governments. We must also continue to encourage public participation in our efforts on their behalf through the nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative and campaigns such as If You See Something, Say Something, which was on prominent display at airports and even at the Super Bowl 5 days ago. Homeland security is a team effort. Border and port security is indispensable to Homeland security. Good border security is a barrier to terrorist threats, drug traffickers, transnational criminal organizations, and other threats to national security and public safety. In my first month in office, I visited our southwest border. Smuggling organizations are responsible for almost all those who cross the border illegally. By boat, I saw the South Texas border on the Rio Grande and the shallow places in that river where someone could walk about 200 feet across without getting his knees wet. By helicopter, I saw the Arizona border at the Port Isabel Detention Center near Brownsville, Texas. I saw about 1,000 detainees, only 18% of whom were Mexican, and the rest representing over 30 different nationalities who migrated through Mexico in an effort to get to the United States. In Arizona, I visited the ranchers who live and work on the border, frustrated by the damage to their property caused by those who cross the border illegally. I have met a number of groups and individuals representing a wide range of views about the border and will make it a practice to continue to do so. With the recent addition of funding for staffing and surveillance by Congress, we've made great progress in border and port security. There is now more manpower, technology, and infrastructure on our borders than ever before, but we must remain vigilant. The answer is not simply to build longer or taller fences. As my predecessor used to say, show me a 50-foot fence and I will show you a 51-foot ladder. Border control experts preach an intelligence-driven, risk-based approach that focuses resources on the places where our surveillance and intelligence tell us the threats to border security exist, and be prepared to move when the threat moves. I believe in this approach because it is a smart, effective, and efficient use of resources. I also believe in smart and effective use of our resources when it comes to removals. We must prioritize our resources on those who represent threats to national security, public safety, and border security. In the Senate confirmation process, I pledged to continually evaluate our removal priorities to ensure that we get this right, and I have already begun this process. We must also continually review conditions at our detention facilities to ensure that they are safe and humane. We are gratified by the support Congress has provided to our border and port security efforts, and we need the additional border and port security resources that immigration reform legislation would provide. In this regard, the Republicans' recent statement of principles on immigration is a serious step forward on immigration reform and contains a lot to work with both parties' recognition that our immigration system is broken and needs to be fixed. This should not be an issue used in one way or another for political advantage. Rather, we must look to find common sense solutions to a problem we all know we have. The President, the business and labor communities, people of both parties, and others all recognize that immigration reform is a matter of economic growth. Immigration reform is also a matter of homeland security. There are an estimated 11.5 million undocumented immigrants living in this country. They are not going away. They are not going to self-deport. Most have been here for years. Many have come here as children. As a matter of homeland security, we should encourage these people to come out of the shadows of American society, pay taxes and fines, and be held accountable and be given the opportunity to get on a path to citizenship like others. This is not a special path to citizenship, as I see it. It is an opportunity to get online behind those who are here legally. This is not rewarding people for breaking the law. It is giving them the opportunity to get right with the law. And it is preferable to what we have now. When reform legislation is enacted, DHS must be prepared to implement reform. So, to prepare for this potential outcome, I have already directed the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security to coordinate the process to ensure we are ready to implement the law. Next, DHS must continue efforts to address the growing cyber threat, illustrated by the real, pervasive, and ongoing series of attacks on things like stores, banks, email services, power substations, and the public that depends on them. Here, the key to the government's efforts is to build trust with the private sector and attract the best and the brightest from the private sector to come work for us. People like Dr. Phyllis Schneck, our Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity, who came to us 6 months ago from the position of Chief Technology Officer of the security software company McAfee. I am personally going on a talent search. Next week, Phyllis and I are traveling to Georgia Tech, where she received her PhD, to recruit more like her. I'm also a big fan of programs like Cyber Student Volunteer Initiative, which allows college students on a volunteer basis to come work for DHS in support of cybersecurity and allows us to educate them on our mission. Through the President's Executive Order 13636 on critical infrastructure cybersecurity and Presidential Policy Directive 21 on strengthening the security and resilience of critical infrastructure, both issued a year ago, we are making good progress, furthering our partnerships with the private sector. But there is more to do. Many in Congress have expressed a willingness to help in cybersecurity. We appreciate those efforts. Our basic legislative goals are: 1, new hiring and pay flexibility to recruit cybersecurity talent; 2, modernizing the Federal Information Security Management Act, also called FISMA, to reflect new technology; 3, additional clarity for and codification of existing DHS responsibility to protect the federal government's civilian cyber networks; 4, legal clarity that DHS may provide assistance to the private sector when requested; 5, legal clarity that the private sector may exchange cybersecurity information with the federal government; and 6, enhanced criminal penalties for cybercrimes. We could also support some form of limitation on potential civil liability for private sector entities, provided it is narrow and targeted in a way necessary to protect networks. We must continue to be vigilant in preparing for and responding to disasters, including floods, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, and most recently, chemical leaks like the one into the Elk River in West Virginia that threatened the water supply of hundreds of thousands of people. FEMA has come a long way from the days of Katrina. We have improved disaster planning with public and private sector partners, nonprofit organizations, and the American people. We have learned how to pre-position a greater number of resources. We have strengthened the nation's ability to respond to disasters in a quick and robust fashion. We are helping communities and cities recover and rebuild faster. We will continue this progress. Finally, we must be mindful of the environment in which we pursue these missions. We operate in a time of severe budget constraints. The days when those of us in national and homeland security can expect more and more each year to our top-line budgets are over. I am therefore obligated to identify and eliminate inefficiencies, waste, and unnecessary duplications of effort and expenditures while pursuing important missions, such as recapitalization of the Coast Guard fleet. DHS also operates at a time when the public's confidence in the government's ability to function and work for them is low. DHS is unique among federal agencies for the large daily engagement it has with the public at airports, seaports, and land ports of entry. The public's attitude toward the entire federal government can be shaped by interactions with the Department of Homeland Security. We must be mindful of this as we seek public support for our work. This is why I am pleased to announce that the Acting Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection will soon make CBP's use of force policy public. We must do a better job of highlighting the good things we do on behalf of the American people with the resources they give us. In January, I opened a new TSA PreCheck application center at Dulles Airport. TSA PreCheck illustrates the risk-based approach to Homeland Security that I talked about earlier. It is smart, effective, and an efficient use of resources and taxpayer dollars. In December, we extended TSA PreCheck benefits to all military, including those serving in the Coast Guard, the Reserves, and the National Guard. By permitting travelers to provide information about themselves ahead of time, we expedite the process for them at airports and better focus resources to the pool of people we know less about. This advances aviation security and should be popular with the traveling public. Lastly, I am mindful of surveys that reflect that morale is low within various components of DHS. Our greatest asset as a department is our people. Each and every day, the men and women of DHS work hard to fulfill our critical and noble mission. Each day, they dedicate themselves to the security and advancement of our nation. I will be a champion for those men and women of DHS and will advocate on their behalf. Morale also depends on good leaders in place at each of our components. We must inject a new energy into DHS, and good leadership starts with recruiting other good leaders to help join the team, to help run the organization. With the help of the White House and Congress, we are bringing in some terrific people to fill in the large number of senior management vacancies that exist within DHS. I spend a part of almost every day on this. I'm pleased that in December, Congress confirmed our new Deputy Secretary, Ali Mayorkas, and in October, our new General Counsel, Steve Bunnell. We look forward to the Senate confirmation of Suzanne Spalding, who's sitting right here, to be the Undersecretary for National Protection and Programs Directorate, Gil Kerlikowske to be the next Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, John Roth to be the next Inspector General, Leon Rodriguez to be the next Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and Dr. Reggie Brothers to be the next Undersecretary for Science and Technology. We are actively recruiting talented people to be Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis, Director for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the next Chief Financial Officer, and for other key positions. Finally, we will also continually reinforce among all the men and women of the department the common unifying mission of Homeland Security that binds us together. Homeland Security is the most important mission any government can provide for its people. I told you that I was in New York City on 9/11. For years, my secretary at the law firm I was with in Manhattan was a woman named Gina Ciccieri. Gina is a shy, quiet woman who works about 50 hours a week, commutes another 3 hours a day, raises 2 kids, is the wife of a retired New York City police officer, plays by the rules, and never makes waves. At 8:46 a.m. on September 11th, 2011, Gina was walking into the World Trade Center with her 3-year-old daughter to catch the subway to Midtown when American Airlines Flight 11 plowed into the building literally above her. Possessed by nothing but fear, survival instincts, and adrenaline, Gina picked up her daughter and either walked or ran with her daughter in her arms all the way to 14th Street. And anyone who knows Manhattan knows that's a long way even to walk empty-handed. The image of a 5'3" mother running for her life with her child in her arms on 9/11. The image of thousands of desperate and displaced Americans at the Louisiana Superdome during Katrina. The image of the finish line at the Boston Marathon, turning in an instant to a blast zone. These should be constant reminders of the urgency and the importance of our Homeland Security mission. I am aware that there's another component to my job. In the name of Homeland Security, we cannot sacrifice our values as a nation. We can build more walls, install more screening devices, ask more questions, expect more answers, and make people suspicious of each other, but not at the cost of who we are as a nation of people who cherish privacy and freedom, celebrate diversity, carry our flag at the Olympics, and are not afraid. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, I got teared up, as I think others did, by the close of your speech, Mr. Secretary. And let's remember that most in this room, or everyone in this room, are sons and daughters. Many are spouses. Many are parents. And on that day in 9/11, many of us knew people who perished or people who were at risk. And the whole country suffered on your birthday a game-changing experience and a scar that in some ways will never heal. I'm going to ask you some questions in a friendly manner, but designed, I think, to tease out a little more information about some of the topics in your speech and about you. We know you were born on 9/11. I'm told you wanted to be a subway conductor in New York City when you grew up, or close enough to that.
That's my next life.
That's your next life.
I want to be a subway motorman on the number 7 train.
There we go. In case you don't know this, and it matters to me since I have 4 kids and 4 grandkids in New York City, the New York subways are protected to a substantial extent by DHS assets. Thank you. So, look at that. So your background is as a lawyer, an assistant U.S. attorney, and a guy who has a lot of experience in the Department of Defense. What equips you now to take on this awesome responsibility, and it is truly awesome, to be the principal spokesman for our U.S. counterterrorism policy?
Well, let me begin by saying that I lead a terrific organization of men and women, and with the people that are there as leaders, people that we are recruiting additionally to be leaders, I think we're going to be doing a terrific job in the next couple of years. The Department of Defense, a lot of people ask me, well, is DOD like DHS? Are they different? How are they different? The Department of Defense is essentially a military organization. DHS has people in uniform. We have the Coast Guard. But for the most part, DHS is a civilian organization. It's a different culture. But like the Department of Defense, it is a large, rather decentralized organization with components who are capable, if you let them, of running themselves. And so while I was at DOD, I had the privilege of working with 2 terrific secretaries of defense, Bob Gates and Leon Panetta. I was part of their management team. I saw them make decisions. When you're the general counsel, you have purview over the entire Department of Defense, unlike almost everybody else. And so I was part of the management team, helped solve a lot of problems, was involved in a number of the difficult issues. And as you remarked, I've been involved in national security since since I came back to government in February 2009. I've been eyewitness to many historic events that occurred and involved in some of the decision making here in Washington. But I'd say that the thing that comes to mind first when you ask a question like that is I have a passion for the mission. I left government a year ago thinking I was done. I was settling back into private law practice, private life, and the president asked me if I would do this job. It never occurred to me that I would be sitting here, that I would be asked to do this job, but I have a passion for the mission. I believe deeply in the mission, and I want to serve the country again, so that's why I'm here.
Good answer. And you do have good people around you. I have to give my own shout out to Suzanne Spalding, who was the staff director of something called the National Commission on Terrorism, formed by Congress in 1999. It was one of 3 groups that predicted a major attack on U.S. soil. I was on that group, and lamenting with its chairman on 9/10/2001 that people weren't paying attention. Well, people then started to pay attention, and Suzanne, of course, went on to become the chief counsel to the House Homeland Security Committee, to the Democratic side, when I was the ranking member. So she's very well trained for the mission, sir, as are many other people who work with you. Since I mentioned Congress, let's talk about Congress. I am still
I love Congress.
Good start.
I do. I love Congress. I like to go up on the Hill. Nobody believes me, but I like to go.
You're going to get a lot of opportunity to do that.
I know. I know. I did the other day. I was on the Hill, and I said to our Ledger Affairs person, let's do some drive-bys. Let's stop off and see friends of mine. Huh? What? Are you sure? Don't we make appointments? And, well, we can do that, but I'll just stop and say Happy New Year, and caught a number of very important members of Congress by surprise. But it's relationship building, and there are an awful lot of members of Congress that I know and respect.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that. Right. When Michael Chertoff, your predecessor, was the Secretary of Homeland Security, he would routinely invite me as the chairman of a subcommittee down here for breakfast, and we would talk about issues. And we formed a professional relationship which has developed into a friendship. And those relationships matter. Now, the drive-by thing sounds great, and I know you're having fun, but it is a fact that 100 committees and subcommittees of the United States Congress, this is not an exaggeration, have some piece of the Homeland Security mission. I remember, I think it was on the National Journal cover, but somewhere it looked like a Where's Waldo picture. It showed all the different jurisdictions. The 9/11 Commission, and we have Richard Benveniste, who was a member of it, recommended a number of things which Congress did and the president did, except there is one glaring gap, and that gap was to reorganize Congress in a way that would streamline the Homeland mission. Right. So you are going to get numerous requests to testify across the board, and that's one issue in terms of the time sap for you. But the other way is when you're a member of Congress and you want to do something legislatively, let's say cybersecurity reform, which we'll get to in a moment, or pick one, reduction of overclassification of material. You're on a committee, and that committee has a piece of jurisdiction, but not the whole thing. And so it's very frustrating from Congress's end. I'm saying something sympathetic to Congress here. Let it be noted. From Congress's end to do something too. So how, for sure you've thought about this, how are you personally going to navigate this?
Well, I don't think the answer is simply, and it shouldn't be, get off my back. There are a lot of people interested in the Homeland Security mission on both sides who ask, how can I help you? How can I work with you? How can I support your mission? And so part of my remarks this morning was to try to answer that in the cybersecurity world by spelling out what I think our basic legislative priorities should be. Some of it might have a better chance of passing than others, but I did want to spell out what I think the legislative goals of the cybersecurity mission should be. You're right that there are a lot of committees and subcommittees who have a piece of the department, and as you know, Jane, from your own experience, members of Congress committees don't often cede jurisdiction. Very protective about that. So, at least in the beginning, I want to try to build the relationships on the Hill. At some point, we'll have to have a discussion about realigning the jurisdiction of Congress because it does require a lot of time and attention by the Secretary and the senior leadership of the department to go back and forth in response to requests for committee testimony or individual visits. And that is time that is useful, valuable time for a senior leader. But I do find it useful to know what's on the mind of members of Congress. The Senate confirmation process, is what it is. I had a relatively good experience. It was 2 months from nomination to confirmation, but it is an opportunity to find out what's on their minds. There are a number of very thoughtful members of Congress who are embedded in these issues, who gave me a lot of insights in that process. But you're right. There's a tremendous amount of oversight, and it needs to be realigned at some point. And at some point, I will be asking our colleagues on the Hill to help us with that.
Well, I applaud your interest in getting to know members. It will help. There are many good people who serve on Capitol Hill in both parties. The business model needs a lot of work, and the committee structure is from the 19th century. But there are opportunities, especially if you invest personally in changing at least some of the dynamic there. And let's just move to cybersecurity, since you mentioned it and you carefully identified some issues in your remarks. Last year, I think it was last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, time flies, Congress tried hard but failed to pass cybersecurity legislation.
2012.
2 years ago. Most people think, and I would ask you to amplify this, that we are enormously vulnerable to cyber threats. The private sector basically controls at least 85% of our cyber systems, and a lot of those have to do with critical infrastructure. The President issued, President Obama, an executive order which goes partway toward solving some of the critical problems of aligning the private sector and the public sector. But how urgent do you think it is to pass legislation, and how can you, as the leader of the Homeland Department, overcome what was one of the huge objections before, which is the private sector didn't have confidence that Homeland had the capacity to handle its responsibilities on cyber?
Well, it is actually not a cybersecurity threat. It is a cybersecurity, it is an ongoing series of attacks from various different sources on banks, on substations, on email services that happen on a fairly regular basis of various different degrees of intensity. And so it is no longer just a threat. It is real. It is here. I think that the key, aside from the help that Congress can give us, the keys are breaking down barriers, building trust with the private sector, and I'm developing ideas with Suzanne for how we do that, who we meet with, what business groups, what private sector entities we should go to explain our mission. And I think it's also, as I mentioned in my remarks, a talent search. I think the resources, the talent are there, particularly among our young people in graduate schools, people who are just out of school. We were talking earlier about the cyber talent that exists in the military. The military recruits from a very early age, and the military is very good at identifying those within the ranks who have a cybersecurity talent and bringing them into the cybersecurity world within the Department of Defense. We have to build that talent from either within our civilian workforce or attract from the private sector. And so part of my job in the cybersecurity realm will be to look for ways to attract private talent, because I know it's there.
Would it also help if you worked on it, and I think you're doing this, better management for the department as a whole? Not to criticize any individuals, but it is a huge task to integrate the cultures of 22 different agencies and departments.
Yes, absolutely.
And still a work in progress. But if you had better management to mirror the good management in many private sector firms, would that help instill confidence? Because the big objection 2 years ago was, it's not a well-managed department. I'm not saying this is fair, but this was the objection, and we're wary of cooperating with it.
I won't disagree with you. I think that, first of all, when you talk about cybersecurity, we have NPPD, which is an office within DHS headquarters, but there are components of the Department of Homeland Security who also have a cybersecurity mission. For example, the Secret Service. Secret Service is into financial crimes. It's into cybersecurity. Secret Service is very involved right now in the effort regarding the Target stores. And I think that the key to answer, one of the keys to answer the dilemma, the question you pose, Jane, is visible leadership. Good leadership, but also visible leadership. Good leaders bring in good leaders, but I think that we have to be fairly transparent to become familiar with the private sector, to become familiar with the public, so that we build trust. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today.
And do you have plans to get out and about? I know you said you've traveled to the southern border, and maybe meet with business groups. It's just a thought.
Yes,
to
I do. Yes, we're working on, we're
persuade them to cooperate better.
developing some ideas right now to do that exact thing in all parts of the country.
Turning to a few other issues. First, on the Homeland threat. One of the things that was clear to me when I was in the roles I had in Congress was how important the mission of vertical information sharing was to the department. It's not just a role played here in federal GovLand, sharing information among the federal agencies, but it is getting information down to first responders, who could be police, but who also could be private citizens who smell something strange in the house next door or see something weird anywhere. And that mission is going much better. I'm looking at Charlie Allen, who at one point, after a legendary CIA career, was the head of the intelligence function at DHS, and we talked a lot about this, and fusion centers at the local level and so forth. But one of the improvements, I think, that Congress insisted on was setting up something called the ITAG-G, which stands for Interagency Threat Assessment and Coordination Group. And what it was a sort of Teach for America group of state and local law enforcement folks who would come temporarily, be detailed by their departments, to the Department of Homeland Security and the National Counterterrorism Center, which was created just about at the same time under the Intelligence Reform Law of 2004. And they would advise on what the bulletins should look like that go vertically from the Department of Homeland Security, or NCTC, down to first responders, so that first responders could understand what to look for and what to do. Are you aware of these efforts, these outreach efforts, and do you think they need support?
Yes, absolutely. I think that given the evolving terrorist threat, which is becoming more decentralized, more diffuse, as I said in my remarks, less of a traditional Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-like command and control structure. We have to be more concerned about homegrown threats, the lone wolf, the person who self-radicalizes, or the small group or conspiracy of people who self-radicalize. I think that is going to require that we continue to build relationships with first responders. And in Boston Marathon bombing was a perfect, unfortunate illustration of this, where we need, as a department and as a federal government, to build relationships with state and local law enforcement, state and local governments, because the federal government cannot be everywhere. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, cannot be everywhere. So that is critically important in my view, and that's something that I hope to advance over the next couple of years. You are also correct that Homeland Security is a team effort that involves the public. We don't want to scare people. We don't want to make people paranoid. We don't want to make people fear each other because of our differences. But Homeland Security involves public participation in, if you see something, say something, to repeat a coined phrase. And that can result in very constructive, positive things if there is public awareness about what's in the trash container at the large bus terminal, or what's in the backpack that was left at the gate, or something like that. If people are willing to note a suspicious package and report it to the nearest aviation security person or law enforcement officer, that can have a tremendous effect. We all hope that it never gets that far, but public participation in our efforts is critical, so that we never get to the point where innocent civilians have to take matters into their own hands to save their own lives.
As your secretary obviously had to do. That's a compelling story. Part of that, too, is building trust with the public, which is a function, I think, that you as the counterterrorism spokesperson in chief have, but so do local police departments. And there have been very successful outreach efforts in Minneapolis, where the recruitment of some folks by al-Shabaab has been going on, in Los Angeles, where the sheriff's department has had some very good cooperation with the Muslim community. It's not only the Muslim community that has problems. We have to understand that a lot of lone wolf terrorists like Timothy McVeigh had nothing to do with the Muslim community. But it is important that these outreach efforts generate confidence, so that if you see something in your own house or in a community center or at the local supermarket, you think that saying something to law enforcement or saying something to the FBI or saying something to somebody, someplace that will get the information where it needs to go is an appropriate thing to do.
That's correct. When I went on my trip to the southwest border, I spent a lot of time meeting with mayors and county sheriffs and police chiefs for exactly this reason. And so, as I see it, we need to continue to emphasize that this is a collective effort that involves multiple levels of government and the public.
Moving to border security, you mentioned comprehensive immigration reform, and it almost passed Congress, in case anyone remembers this. In 2007, President Bush very courageously put forward a proposal. One of its biggest advocates inside government was your predecessor, Michael Chertoff, who was heartbroken, I remember this, when the bill failed. And now the Senate has passed a comprehensive immigration reform bill. There was conversation in the House that the House version might be different. You commended the Congress in your remarks for the effort it's making, but in today's press, there is a new comment from House Speaker John Boehner that it may not happen this year, I think, which is going to be a great disappointment to many communities across our country who are hoping it will, and to our efforts to rebuild our economy after the most serious recession since the Great Depression. What can you do to persuade John Boehner that maybe he should, of steps he might take in this election year to get this thing back on the right track? Because he was one of the people who said he wanted to try to make this happen.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and there are people who talk to the Speaker about this and other issues. I'm sure he's getting no shortage of advice right now. What I hope will happen in 2014 is that there is an emerging, evolving realization that this should not be politics, that this is a problem that we have in this country that needs to be fixed, and that those of us here in Washington who represent the American public ought to do what we need to do to fix the problem. Everybody agrees we have a problem with immigration, with enforcement and administration of our immigration laws. Everybody knows we have millions of undocumented immigrants in this country, and they're not going away. They're not going to self-deport. I don't know exactly what the statistic is, but something like 86% of this 11.5 million people have been in this country for years, going back to either 2004 or 2008, something like that. So they're here and they're not going away. From my Homeland Security perspective, I would rather encourage them to come forward, be accountable, pay whatever taxes and fines they owe, go through the background check, and if they are able to, going through all of that, eventually, after, and I think the Senate bill talks about a 13-year period, which is not tomorrow, and that won't be in the life of this administration or the administration after this one, 13 years, get to a path to citizenship if they are able to do so. I think we need to deal with this problem, and so I'm hoping that, and I really do see the signs for this. I thought that was a very thoughtful statement of principles that the Speaker and others spent a lot of time thinking about. I don't know to what extent it has the widespread support in the Republican caucus, but the document is identifying a problem that we have in this country and seeks to address it. And I think that is a very positive step to see both major parties recognize that we ought to deal with this. And the message that I'd like to convey and emphasize is that from the Homeland Security perspective, this is something we need to do because of the added border and port resources that comprehensive, common sense immigration reform provides, and so that we can encourage people to be accountable, which in my judgment is not giving them a pass in some way. It's encouraging them to get right with the law. So from my Homeland Security perspective, I hope that people in the Congress, people in government will finally wrestle with this problem and we can deal with it.
Well, just one more comment and one more question on this. I think the right term is earned legalization. It surely isn't amnesty. People have to go through a lot of hurdles and then get in the back of the line, and 13 years later, maybe, if this law passes, can become citizens. But the Speaker was quoted as saying, the American people don't trust that the reform that we're talking about will be implemented as it was intended to be. Should people trust you and your department to implement reforms and implement the current law?
Well, first of all, we've already begun thinking about if the legislation that is contemplated in various different forms becomes law, we're going to have to implement it. And as contemplated, implementation will occur over a period of years. It's not like it's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to occur over a period of years. But we're beginning to think about what we need to do to get ready for this. So this is an advanced planning team effort so to anticipate what the department needs to do when and if this legislation passes. And I believe that we will have comprehensive immigration reform. I don't have a crystal ball on the timetable. That's for others who are better at that than me, but I believe it will pass. I am assuming that it will pass. I am optimistic, and we need to prepare for it, and we've already started that process.
Let's turn to some of the outside the U.S. issues. You mentioned Syria, and you said Syria has become a matter of homeland security. You did amplify that comment a bit, but I think the audience might be interested in any additional comments you want to make about why Syria has become a matter of homeland security.
Well, as I stated, and as others like Director Brennan, Director Comey have stated over the last couple of days, we are concerned about the foreign fighters going into Syria. who are leaving, will leave Syria. And when they get to Syria, they are encountering all sorts of radical extremist influences there. And we need to be concerned about that. And so that's why I refer to it as a matter of homeland security. And it's not just this country. Our European allies are very concerned about this issue. And so in the conference I just left in Poland, as I mentioned, this was a major, major topic of discussion. And collectively, we're determined to do something about it.
I think people do need to understand that there is a variety of terror groups in Syria, not a monolith, not all Al-Qaeda, but some of them have expressed a desire, that's right, to train fighters in Syria to attack interests in the West. And whether that actually will happen or not, it's a threat of people being radicalized here, moving to Syria, conducting terror acts there, being better trained, and then coming back here. Am I correct in the way I assess
we need
that?
we need to do our best to pay close attention to an evolving situation.
And while we're talking about self-radicalization, you were very careful in the way you talked about it, and we have experts in this audience, especially Brian Michael Jenkins of the RAND Corporation, who has studied radicalization carefully. By the way, one of the things some of us tried to do in Congress was to create a multidisciplinary commission to advise Congress on what the hallmarks are of someone who has radical views which are protected by our Constitution, turning into someone who's prepared to engage in violent acts, which are a crime, and finding that little nexus. We were not able to pass the legislation because in the last minute it became controversial, unfortunately, at least in my view. But a hallmark of some of these homegrown lone wolf types is they have clean records. They haven't committed violent acts before. Many of them are on the internet looking at sites that teach them how to build bombs and so forth. Certainly the Boston Marathon bombers use the internet. And there's a lot on the internet there. But some of them also intersect people either in our country or travel abroad who, and most people think it takes human intervention beyond just the internet to radicalize someone. So you said this is a focus. I mean, how should the American public, which is listening to you right now, think about this?
I wanted to convey the answer to that question in my remarks. The federal government, state and local governments, first responders, law enforcement in local communities needs to be vigilant. And we're building that, we're building those relationships. Because of the nature of what we're talking about here, I think we risk going too far. We risk breeding suspicion, fear among people about those that are different from them. And that was really the purpose of the last part of my remarks. You know, if you're charged with thinking about Homeland Security, whether you're me or the state Homeland Security advisor to the governor or police commissioner, you can build walls, you can build something that is so secure that you make everybody paranoid. And you deprive people of the basic privacy and freedoms that this country is all about. And we can't do that. So this is a balance. It's a delicate balance. Do we have it right now? Are we perfect right now? Probably not. But I think that a basic responsibility for those of us charged with Homeland Security and law enforcement and national security is to find that right balance and to be sensitive to it, because we can go too far, and there are instances in the history of this government where we have done that. And so we need to be mindful of that and sensitive to it.
Well, again, in my opening remarks, I commended you for your Oxford speech on Guantanamo and on drones, which got a lot of attention and was a very courageous act for someone who had just been the general counsel of the Defense
But I was leaving
Department.
government.
Well, I'm glad you're back and have those values. You say as you close your speech, in the name of Homeland Security, we cannot sacrifice our values as a nation. We can build more walls, install more screening devices, ask more questions, expect more answers, and make people suspicious of each other, but not at the cost of who we are as a nation. And I certainly have believed, and I do believe, that it is not enough just to take out bad guys, although sometimes we must do that. And very courageous people have very carefully tried to do that. But we have to, in the end, win the argument with some kid in the boonies of Yemen or in an inner city in America who's trying to decide whether to drop a few pressure cooker bombs along the pathway of a marathon or strap on a suicide vest. And if we don't win that argument, there will be more people growing up against us than we can possibly take out. In fact, that was a kind of a metaphor that Don Rumsfeld once used when he was the Secretary of Defense in one of his snowflakes. And do you agree with that?
I do, and that is one of the things I said at the Oxford Union, that we have to be sensitive to, with our actions, not breeding those who want to do harm against Americans faster than we can take them out. And I think one of the things that we will do, and I think we've begun this process, one of the things we will do in this administration, in this government, is to develop ideas for how we can address this issue in the homeland, because we need to be sensitive to the fact that there are people who, while they live in this country, hate this country for various different reasons and want to do harm to others who feel disenchanted, disassociated, disconnected, and are influenced by forces beyond our control. And we need to try to address that audience in some way or another to get at this exact issue. And I think I want to, and I know others want to in our government, begin thinking about this issue. We've already started developing ideas for how we can go about doing a better job of that.
Well, I personally commend that thought and want to underscore the last part of your last sentence of your speech where you said, we are a nation of people who cherish privacy and freedom, celebrate diversity, carry our flag at the Olympics, and are not afraid. And I think that your statement of our values as a country is a big piece of your job. And if you are to become, and you will become, the face of warning about the terror threat, it would be wonderful if you're also the face of reassurance that our country will survive this and that we will be resilient. And I know you said that you're going to Boston on the anniversary of the marathon bombing. There was a place, I must say, I watched proudly as an American, where a horrible thing happened, but a community pulled together very quickly and never lost its stride. And we didn't do it that well on 9/11, but we did it that well in Boston, Boston Strong. And so I would hope that those are lessons that we can learn, not just we, the people listening to you on the outside, and many former members of government and present members of government looking at you, but that we can learn, that the Department of Homeland Security can learn and can teach and can help inspire others to teach. And so I'd just like to close this event, which I think has been a wonderful honor for the Wilson Center and an example of the kinds of things we do here. I didn't mention that John Brennan, when he was the counterterrorism advisor in the White House, asked to come here to talk for the first time about the U.S. government's use of drones.
I was sitting right there.
There you were. Well, it was a wonderful event, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. But as we close this event, let me just offer you the last word, Secretary Johnson, to any last thoughts you have about
As they say at the
this
White
your
House.
first major speech?
As they say at the White House, parting shots. This is, Jane, thank you again for your leadership. Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for your mentorship and support. This is a terrific organization. It is educational. It is sober. It is a place for thoughtful, intelligent discussion.
It is nonpartisan.
And it is not partisan. So, and when you talk about national security and homeland security, it should not be partisan. And I believe that fervently. So thank you for the terrific work you do here. I'm sure I'll see you again.
Well, I thank you, and as I've said for years, the terrorists are not going to check our party registration before they blow us up. So we better focus on this as a country, and thank you for coming here as an American, talking about a challenge that America faces and a department that wants to be even better at keeping us safe. Thank you again.
Thank you.